enthusiasm, still had this one thing bothering him. And the thing that was bothering him was that God's very own people destroyed, participated in the crucifixion of God's own Son. And how do you deal with that? Paul says they had everything. And how is it with their privilege and all that God had blessed them with, how is it they did not recognize the Messiah? Oh, many did, right? But as a whole, he still had this burden. How could God's people participate in the crucifying of God's Son? And so now Paul spends, and we're going to look at some of this. We can't read all 3 chapters today. That's why I want you need to be studying these chapters at home, and I know many of you are, as we've been through this series. Paul spends 3 chapters of the letter now puzzling over the dilemma. Because the truth is, Paul still was puzzled about this. And as we end our study, we'll see that he says he's still puzzled about it, okay? So he puzzles over this dilemma. What's going to happen to Israel? What's going to happen to the people who were the very, very core, the people through whom the Messiah came? What's going to happen to them? And, you know, both chapters 9 and chapters 10, he begins them both the same. Notice in chapter 10, verse 1, "Brother, my heart's desire, my prayer to God for them is for what? Their salvation." He keeps repeating this over. Wishing and praying for the salvation of Israel. And so Paul muses. And so, as we go through these verses, he muses several things. And we can't pay attention to all of them, but just some high points that he muses. What about the promises? All right? What about those promises? You remember the promises, don't you? And any good Israelite would remind you of the promises. What are some of those promises? Notice verse 8 of chapter 9. That is, it is not the children of the flesh who are children of God, but the children of the promise are regarded as what? Descendants. Here he's musing over, what about the promises to the descendants? And he comes to the conclusion, maybe it isn't the promise to those who are descended through this family tree, but the promise is to who? Here is the first hint in which Paul talks about spiritual Israel. And in his musing, he's coming to this conclusion that maybe it wasn't through the flesh. The promises that God made to Abraham and all the way down through. And he as much says that. It is not the children of the flesh who are the children of God. And Paul reviews all the genealogical arguments of blessing that a typical Israelite would list. By the way, folks, evangelicals are still using those arguments today. Still using those arguments today. That the promises to Israel remained true because of their what? Because of their lineage. And how could God go back on his promises? Because of their what? Lineage. But Paul is dealing with this real sticky problem here. Lots of commentators don't even like to mess with 9 through 11. Lots have just stayed away from it. Some say there's too many problems in here. You bet there is. And that's why you need to understand. What about Israel? What about Israel? Notice, as he goes on, and you have to read all these verses, and I'm just pointing a few out. He says that, first of all, those who are descended of Israel are not necessarily what? Israel.